The war horn had not sounded in 3 years, but tonight it felt close enough to touch. Cade Ashgrove stood at the head of the long stone table, both hands pressed flat against its surface, listening to a report he did not want to hear. Scouts had spotted movement along the eastern ridge, close to the river that marked the border between his territory and the Voss pack. Torches, wagons, too many wolves for a hunting party, too few for a full invasion. Something in between, something designed to test him. How many? Cade asked. His voice was low and even, the voice of a man who had learned long ago that panic never survived a fight, only made it messier. 40, maybe 50, said Rowan, his second in command, a broad-shouldered man with a scar along his jaw that never quite let his face rest easy. Garrick's colors were on the banners. He's not hiding who sent them. He wants us to see him, Cade said. He wants us afraid before he ever crosses the river. The room was full of pack elders and warriors, all of them watching their king with the kind of tired trust that came from years of him making the right call under pressure. Cade had inherited the throne young, earlier than any Ashgrove before him, when his father collapsed at a border meeting and never woke again. 3 years of ruling had hollowed something out of him and replaced it with iron. He did not sleep well anymore. He did not remember the last time he had laughed, without calculating who was watching him do it. Double the patrols along the ridge, Cade said. No one crosses onto Voss land, and no one from Voss sets a boot on ours without answering to me personally. I want eyes on that camp by morning. The elders nodded. Rowan lingered after the others filed out, arms crossed, studying Cade with the particular concern of a man who had known him since they were both pups tumbling in the training yard. You look like you haven't eaten in 2 days, Rowan said. I haven't had time. You never have time. One of these days, that's going to be the thing that kills you. Not Garrick. Cade almost smiled. Almost. Noted. Rowan hesitated at the door. Your mother asked about you again. Ivy said she barely left her rooms this week. Something tightened behind Cade's ribs, quick and uncomfortable, the way it always did when his mother's name came up. Seraphine Ashgrove had once been the warmest presence in the pack house, the kind of Luna who remembered every child's birthday and every widow's grief. Since his father's death, she had folded in on herself like a flower starved of light. Cade told himself he would visit her tomorrow. He had told himself that yesterday too. I'll see her, he said, and Rowan, wisely, did not push further. There was a gathering that evening. Cade had almost forgotten it in the chaos of border reports, a small diplomatic dinner meant to smooth relations with 2 neighboring packs, who were not yet enemies but were not quite friends either. He hated these events. He hated the false laughter, the careful words, the way every handshake felt like it was being measured for a hidden blade. But a king who skipped diplomacy invited war just as surely as one who ignored his borders. He dressed in dark formal clothes that did nothing to soften the sharpness of his face, and he walked into the great hall, already tired of the night before it began. The hall was bright with candlelight and low conversation, long tables set with more food than any of the guests would actually eat, because these dinners were never about the food. Cade moved through the room the way he moved through everything, controlled, unreadable, offering exactly enough warmth to be polite and no more. And then, without warning, the entire room tilted. It was not dramatic. No one gasped. No candle flickered out. But something in Cade's chest turned over so hard, and so suddenly, that he had to stop walking, one hand finding the back of a chair to steady himself. His wolf, usually a quiet and disciplined presence beneath his skin, surged forward all at once, alert and hungry, and desperate in a way it had never been before. Mate. The word arrived in his mind like a struck bell, and Cade's eyes swept the room, before his conscious thought had even caught up with his instinct. He was not looking for a threat. He was looking for her. He found her near the side entrance, half hidden behind a serving cart, clearly not a guest. She wore the simple gray tunic of pack staff, her sleeves pushed up to her elbows, a satchel of small glass vials slung across one shoulder. She was young, maybe in her early 20s, with light brown hair pulled back in a practical braid, and an expression of complete disinterest in the glittering room around her, as if she had somewhere better to be. She was, without question, the least important person in the entire hall by rank, and Cade could not look away from her if the building had caught fire. "My king," said the noble beside him, a Voss envoy named Halden who had been mid-sentence about grain shipments, when Cade had simply stopped responding. "Excuse me," Cade said, and walked away without another word, which was so unlike him that Halden actually turned to watch him go. Cade crossed the hall with more urgency than he had allowed himself to show in years. Up close, the pull was worse. It sat under his skin like a low current, humming, insistent, demanding that he close the last few feet of distance between them. The woman noticed him approaching and straightened, adjusting the satchel on her shoulder, her expression shifting from disinterest to mild wariness, the way anyone might look at a stranger walking toward them too fast. "You're not one of the servers," Cade said, which was not what he had meant to say at all. "No," she agreed, unbothered. "I'm Wren. I work with the pack healer. I was told to drop off remedies for 2 of the kitchen staff who came down with fever, not to make conversation with the king." There was no reverence in her voice, no nervous stammer, no lowered eyes, none of the careful deference every other person in this hall had shown him tonight. She said it plainly, the way one might explain a delivery schedule to a stranger who had wandered into the wrong room. "You know who I am," Cade said. "Everyone knows who you are. That doesn't mean I have anything useful to say to you." She glanced past him at the hall full of nobles. "You might want to go back to your guests. That man in the blue coat looks like he's about to combust from being ignored." Cade almost laughed. He caught himself before he did, unsettled by how close it had come. Nothing about this moment made sense to him. He had waited his entire adult life for the mate bond, had assumed, in the quiet corners of his mind, that it would arrive wrapped in something grand, a warrior, a noble woman, someone who understood the weight of the crown, even if she did not wear one herself. Instead, it had arrived in a healer's assistant who clearly had no idea what had just happened, and even less interest in finding out. "What's your name again?" he asked, though he had heard her the first time. "Wren," she said, already turning to leave. "Callahan, if you'll excuse me, my king, the fever won't cure itself." She walked away before he could stop her, weaving through the crowd with the ease of someone who had learned long ago how to become invisible in rooms full of important people. Cade stood there for a long moment, feeling the pull of the bond stretched taut between them like a rope refusing to snap, and understood, with the particular dread of a man who had just lost control of something he had spent his whole life mastering, that his carefully ordered world had just cracked straight down the middle. He did not sleep that night. He lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling of his private chambers, trying to make sense of the fact that the woman who would apparently share his throne for the rest of his life had looked at him with all the awe one might reserve for a mildly inconvenient delivery route. Every instinct in him wanted to march to the healer's quarters immediately and demand answers, demand acknowledgement, demand that she understand exactly what had happened between them in that hall. But some quieter, more careful part of him, the part that had kept his pack alive through 3 years of border threats and political knives, told him to wait, to watch, to learn who this woman was before he did something as king that he could not undo as a man. Before dawn, restless and unwilling to lie in bed any longer, Cade found himself walking the lower corridors of the castle, the ones used by staff rather than nobles, plain stone instead of polished marble. He told himself he was checking on the night guard. He knew that was not true. He was walking toward the healer's quarters without any plan for what he would say once he arrived. The healer's wing was quiet at that hour, lit by a single lamp near the door. Through a half-open window he could hear low voices, an older woman instructing someone on how much of a particular root to grind for a fever tonic. He recognized the second voice immediately, calm and unhurried even at this hour, asking a question about dosage that showed she took her work seriously, even when no one important was watching. He did not go in. He stood in the shadow of the corridor for longer than he would ever admit to anyone, listening to a conversation about herbs and measurements, feeling something in his chest loosen slightly, for the first time in years. There was no performance in her voice. No awareness that a king stood 20 feet away. Just a woman, doing her work carefully, because the people she treated mattered to her. Eventually, the older healer, a broad woman named Della, who had served the pack for decades, stepped out to fetch water, and nearly walked straight into him. "My king," she said, startled, pressing a hand to her chest. "You gave me a fright. Is something wrong?" "No," Cade said quickly. "Nothing is wrong. I was told one of the kitchen staff fell ill. I wanted to see that it was handled." Della's eyes narrowed slightly, the look of a woman who had raised 3 sons and could smell an excuse from across a room. "It's handled, my king. Ren has it well in hand. She's better with fevers than I am these days, if I'm honest." "Ren," Cade repeated, as though testing the shape of the name in his mouth for the first time, though of course, it was not the first time at all. "You met her last night, I heard," Della said, watching him with new interest. "She mentioned a strange encounter with you at the dinner. Didn't seem to think much of it." Something in Cade's expression must have shifted, because Della's eyebrows rose slightly, and she did not press further, though her curiosity was plain. "Get some rest, my king," she said instead, gently, the way she might have spoken to him as a boy. "Whatever is keeping you awake will still be there in the morning." Cade returned to his own chambers without ever setting foot inside the healer's quarters, carrying with him the sound of Ren's voice, discussing dosages, as though it were the most valuable piece of intelligence gathered by any of his scouts that week. By morning, the scouts had returned with more details on the Voss encampment, and Cade forced himself back into the rhythm of ruling, signing orders, reviewing patrol routes, meeting with his advisors about the grain shortage in the northern villages. But underneath all of it, a new awareness hummed constantly at the edge of his senses, a thread connecting him to a woman, 2 wings of the castle away, who had no idea she had just become the single most important variable in his entire kingdom. At midday, Rowan found him standing motionless in the corridor outside the council chamber, staring at nothing. "You've been doing that a lot today," Rowan said carefully. "Doing what?" "Standing still. Staring at walls. It's unsettling, coming from you." Cade did not answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of its usual command, only a rare and unguarded honesty that made Rowan straighten in surprise. "I found her," Cade said. "Last night, at the dinner." Rowan's eyebrows lifted. "Your mate. She works in the healer's quarters, Ren Callahan." Cade exhaled slowly, as if saying the name out loud made the entire situation more real and more absurd at once. "She looked at me like I was mildly in her way." For the first time in longer than either of them could remember, Rowan laughed. A real laugh, loud enough that a passing guard glanced over. "Oh," he said, still grinning, "you are in so much trouble." Cade did not disagree. He only turned back toward the council chamber, his mind already circling back to a healer's assistant, with a satchel of glass vials, and absolutely no idea what she had just done to the Alpha King of the Ashgrove pack. By the 3rd day, Cade had convinced himself that summoning Ren to the throne room was a matter of pack business and nothing more. He told Rowan it was about assigning healer duties for the increased border patrols. He told himself the same thing, several times, and did not fully believe it either time. She arrived exactly on time, which surprised him, and stood at a respectful but unimpressed distance from the throne, her hands folded in front of her apron, waiting for him to speak first, rather than filling the silence, the way most people did when nervous in his presence. "You sent for me, my king," she said. "I did." Cade sat forward slightly, studying her the way he studied border reports, searching for details he had missed the first time. Up close, in daylight, she looked even younger than she had at the dinner, though there was nothing young about the steadiness in her eyes. "With increased patrols along the eastern ridge, I want a healer assigned to the border camps in case of injury."
"That makes sense,"
Ren said. "Della usually handles those assignments. I'm surprised you called me in for it instead of her." It was a fair point, and Cade had no good answer for it, because the truth was that he had rearranged an entire logistics decision simply to have a reason to see her again. He was not used to being caught in his own maneuvering, and he did not care for how it felt. "I wanted to hear it directly from someone in the healer's quarters," he said, which was technically true and completely beside the point. Ren studied him for a long moment, tilting her head slightly, the way someone might look at a puzzle that was behaving strangely. "With respect, my king, you could have sent a runner for that. You didn't need to pull me away from patience to ask something Della could have answered in 2 sentences. Cade felt something in him that had not been challenged in years rise up automatically, the old instinct to assert dominance when a subject spoke to him too plainly. He let a thread of his authority bleed into his voice, not quite a growl, but close, the kind of tone that had made seasoned warriors lower their eyes without thinking. "I am the Alpha King. I do not require a reason beyond wanting information directly." He expected the tone to work the way it worked on everyone else, expected her spine to straighten in automatic deference, her eyes to drop, her voice to soften into something more careful. Instead, Ren simply blinked at him, entirely unmoved, as if his authority was a fact she already knew, and filed away somewhere unremarkable, rather than something that required a reaction from her at all. "All right," she said simply. "Then I'll wait here until you decide what information you actually wanted." Cade stared at her. No one spoke to him like that. No one had spoken to him like that since his father died, and even his father had chosen his moments more carefully than this. There was no fear in her at all, and stranger still, no defiance either, no attempt to prove a point or win an argument. She simply did not perform the fear other people performed around him, because as far as Cade could tell, she genuinely did not feel it. "You're not afraid of me," he said, before he could stop himself. "Should I be?" Ren asked, honestly curious, rather than provoking him. "You haven't done anything to me. I don't decide how to feel about people based on their title. I decide based on what they do." It was, Cade thought, either the most refreshing thing anyone had said to him in years, or the single most dangerous habit a person around him could have. Possibly both. "Most people find that title enough," he said. "Most people haven't spent years pulling arrows out of pack warriors and cleaning up after fevers that don't care what anyone's title is," Ren said. "Illness doesn't bow to anyone. Neither do I, particularly. I'm polite. I'm not obedient, just because someone stands taller than me or wears nicer clothes." Cade found himself, against every instinct honed over 3 years of rule, wanting to smile. He did not let himself. Instead, he leaned back in the throne, arms crossed, studying her with new and reluctant fascination. "Tell me about yourself," he said. "That wasn't part of the summons," Ren pointed out, though not unkindly. "I'm the king. I'm adding it to the summons." A flicker of something amused crossed her face then, quickly hidden, but not quickly enough for him to miss it. "Fine. I grew up 2 villages over, in Millbrook. My mother was a healer before me. She died when I was 16, and I finished my training under Della here because Millbrook didn't have anyone left qualified to teach me properly. I've been at the castle for 4 years. I like herb gardens, I dislike large dinners, and I have absolutely no interest in court politics, which I imagine makes me very boring company for a king." She said all of it plainly, without seeking pity for the loss of her mother or admiration for her skill, simply stating facts the way she might describe the weather. Cade found that more compelling than any carefully rehearsed introduction a noblewoman had ever given him. "You're not boring," he said. "You've known me for 3 days," Ren said. "Give it time." This time Cade did smile, just slightly, just at the corner of his mouth, and he saw Ren notice it and file it away with the same careful attention she seemed to give everything. The conversation might have continued, might have wandered further into territory Cade was not ready to name aloud even to himself, but a runner arrived at the throne room door with an urgent message from the border, and the moment dissolved into duty, the way every private moment in his life eventually did. Cade read the message quickly. Voss patrols had pulled back from the ridge overnight without explanation, which was, in its own way, more unsettling than an advance would have been. Garrick did not retreat without a reason, and Cade did not trust reasons he could not see. "I need to deal with this," he said, folding the message closed. "Then deal with it," Ren said simply, already turning to go, as though the entire conversation had cost her nothing, and she felt no particular need to linger over its ending, the way Cade already found himself wanting to. "Ren," Cade said, and she paused at the door, looking back at him with mild curiosity, rather than anticipation. He searched for something to say that was not what he actually wanted to say, which was some clumsy, half-formed admission about mates and bonds, and the strange gravity that had pulled at him since the dinner 3 nights ago. What came out instead was smaller, safer. "My mother has been unwell, quiet, since my father passed. If Della needs an extra set of hands for the dowager's care, I'd rather it be someone thorough." It was, in its own roundabout way, the truth, though it was also a door Cade had not intended to open quite yet. Ren's expression softened slightly, the first real change he had seen in her composure since they'd met. "I didn't know that," she said, and for a moment, the careful distance in her voice thinned into something warmer, something like genuine concern for a woman she had never met. "Grief is hard on anyone, harder still when everyone around you expects you to keep functioning at full strength regardless. You sound like you're speaking from experience," Cade said. I lost my mother too, Ren said simply. I know what it looks like when someone folds in on themselves and calls it coping. She hesitated, then added, I could look in on the Dowager, if it would help. Della's schedule is already full with the border assignments you just gave her. Cade had not planned this. He had meant only to mention his mother's condition in passing, a small honest detail offered to a woman who did not seem to want grand gestures from him. Instead, he had accidentally opened a door that felt, the moment it opened, both terrifying and exactly right. I would appreciate that, he said, and meant it more than he expected to. Ren nodded once, businesslike again, and left the throne room without ceremony, without the lingering glance most people gave him on their way out, hoping for some sign of favor. She simply left to go do the work she had agreed to do, because that was, as far as Cade could tell, the only currency that mattered to her. He sat alone in the throne room for a long moment afterward, turning the border message over in his hands, without really seeing it, his mind circling back instead, to a healer's assistant who had just agreed, without knowing it, to walk directly into the one part of his life he had kept most carefully guarded from outsiders. He told himself it was a simple arrangement, healer to patient, nothing more. He did not believe himself even slightly. Later that afternoon, before the light fully faded, Cade found an excuse to walk past the training yard, telling himself he needed to check on the increased guard rotation. What he found instead was Ren kneeling beside a young warrior named Hollis, who had taken a hard fall during a sparring match, and was clutching his wrist with the stubborn silence of a boy trying very hard not to embarrass himself in front of his friends. Let me see it, Ren said, her voice gentle but firm, the tone of someone who had clearly had this exact argument with stubborn patience many times before. It's fine, Hollis muttered, which was obviously untrue, given the way his face had gone pale. It's fine when I say it's fine, Ren said, and there was no cruelty in it, only patience, the kind that came from genuine care rather than obligation. She took his wrist carefully, pressing along the bone with practiced fingers while Hollis winced. Not broken, badly sprained. You're going to wrap this and rest it for a week, and if you spar again before then I will tell Rowan personally, and he will make you run drills until you regret it. A few of the other warriors laughed at that, and even Hollis managed a reluctant smile, some of the tension leaving his shoulders now that the verdict was not as dire as he'd feared. Cade watched from a short distance, unnoticed for a moment, taking in the easy way she moved between authority and warmth, correcting without humiliating, caring without coddling. You're good at that, he said, stepping closer once she had finished wrapping Hollis's wrist, and sent him off toward the barracks with strict instructions. Ren glanced up, unsurprised to see him, as though she had sensed him standing there the whole time, and simply chosen not to make it a production. Good at what? Telling grown men to stop being foolish about their injuries? It's most of my job. Good with people, Cade clarified. Warriors don't usually take correction well from anyone who isn't ranked above them. They take correction well from anyone who's fixed their wounds enough times to earn it, Ren said, wiping her hands on a cloth from her satchel. Rank doesn't heal broken bones. Competence does. They trust me because I've earned it, not because anyone handed it to me. There was no bitterness in the words, only plain fact. But Cade heard, underneath them, something quietly pointed aimed in his direction, a reminder that titles meant little to her, compared to what a person actually did with their days. He filed it away carefully, the way he filed away every small thing she said, building a picture of a woman who measured worth by action, rather than blood or crown. I should let you finish your rounds, he said. You should, Ren agreed, already turning back toward the row of benches where two more warriors waited, with minor complaints of their own, entirely unbothered by the fact that she had just dismissed the Alpha King from her afternoon, with no more ceremony than she'd shown Hollis. Cade walked away from the training yard slower than he'd walked into it, turning over everything he had learned about her in just a few short exchanges. She had lost her mother young. She had built her worth from nothing but skill and care. She did not fear him, did not flatter him, did not seem to want anything from him at all, beyond being left to do her work in peace. It should have frustrated him. Instead, disastrously, it only made the pull toward her stronger. That evening, Rowan found him standing at the window of his study, watching the last light fade over the training yards, and did not need to ask what was on his mind. You gave her access to your mother, Rowan said, not quite a question. I gave the healer's quarters an assignment, Cade said, It's not the same thing. It's exactly the same thing. And you know it, Rowan said, dropping into the chair across from him without invitation. The privilege of a friendship old enough to survive a crown. You've spent 3 years keeping everyone at arm's length from your mother because you didn't trust anyone to handle her grief carefully. And in 3 days, you've handed that responsibility to a woman you barely know. Cade did not answer right away, because there was no argument he could make that would sound convincing even to himself. Instead, he simply said, quietly, "She isn't like anyone else." Rowan studied him for a long moment, and whatever teasing he might have offered a few days earlier seemed to fade into something more serious, more careful. "No," he agreed. "I don't think she is. Which is exactly why you should be paying attention to what happens next." Cade turned back to the window, watching the dark settle fully over the yard, and did not tell Rowan that he had already been paying attention to nothing else since the moment he first saw her standing near that serving cart with a satchel of glass vials, and absolutely no idea what she meant to him. The Dowager Luna's wing had grown so quiet over the past 3 years that even the castle staff had learned to walk past it softly, as though loud footsteps might disturb a grief that showed no sign of ever settling. Wren had heard the whispers about Seraphine Ashgrove long before she ever knocked on her door. Whispers about a once vibrant Luna who now rarely left her rooms, who took her meals alone, who had stopped attending pack gatherings entirely after her husband's death. Wren knocked twice, waited, and was answered by a soft, tired voice telling her to come in. The room was elegant but dim, curtains drawn halfway against the afternoon light, as though even sunlight felt like too much some days. Seraphine sat near the window in a high-backed chair, a book open on her lap that she did not appear to be reading, her hands folded loosely over the pages. She looked up when Wren entered, polite but distant, the expression of a woman long accustomed to visitors who came out of duty rather than desire. "You must be the healer's assistant," Seraphine said. "Della mentioned someone new would be looking in on me. I appreciate the concern, truly, but I'm quite well. Just tired." "I brought something for the headaches Della mentioned," Wren said, setting her satchel down and pulling out 2 small glass vials. "Willow bark and feverfew, mostly. It should help without making you drowsy during the day." Seraphine accepted the vials with a small, practiced smile, the kind reserved for someone she expected to leave shortly after finishing her task. Wren, however, did not immediately move toward the door. Instead, she glanced at the book resting untouched on Seraphine's lap. "Is it any good?" Wren asked, nodding at the pages. Seraphine blinked, clearly not expecting the question. "I couldn't say. I've read the same page for 3 days now. My mind keeps wandering." "That happens," Wren said, settling uninvited into the chair across from her, which was bold enough that Seraphine's eyebrows lifted slightly in surprise. "My mother used to say grief doesn't let you focus on anything smaller than itself. It just sits there, taking up all the space, until you either make room around it or it swallows everything else whole." Something shifted in Seraphine's expression, a flicker of genuine attention breaking through the polite distance she had maintained. "You sound like you know something about that." "I lost my mother when I was 16, Wren said simply. "It's been years, and there are still days I reach for her before I remember she isn't there to reach for. I don't think that feeling ever fully goes away. I think you just learn to carry it differently." Seraphine was quiet for a long moment, studying the young woman across from her with new curiosity, the careful mask of dutiful distance slipping slightly at the edges. "Most people who come to see me talk around it," she admitted. "They ask how I'm feeling and then look terrified if I actually tell them." "I'm not most people," Wren said, without arrogance, simply stating a fact. "I'd rather hear the truth than a comfortable lie, even if the truth is difficult. It's easier to help someone when I actually know what's wrong." "And if I told you the truth, is that I don't know how to be in this house without him anymore?" Seraphine asked, her voice quieter now, testing. "Then I'd say that makes sense," Wren said. "And I'd ask what part of the house feels the heaviest. Sometimes naming it helps more than people expect." What began as a 10-minute errand stretched, slowly and without either woman quite noticing the shift, into an hour, and then well past it. Seraphine spoke about her husband in fragments at first, cautious, testing whether this stranger would flinch or grow uncomfortable the way so many others had. She did not. Wren listened with the same steady attention she gave to a patient describing symptoms, asking gentle questions, never rushing her, never offering the hollow comfort of phrases like, everything happens for a reason, or he's in a better place. She simply listened, and let Seraphine's grief take up as much space in the room as it needed. Somewhere in that hour, Seraphine found herself laughing, actually laughing, at a story Ren told about a patient who had once insisted his cough was caused by a curse, rather than the 3 pipes of tobacco he smoked daily, and had argued with her for 20 minutes about it, before finally admitting the tobacco might, possibly, be a factor. It was a small thing, a foolish story about a stubborn patient, but the sound of her own laughter startled Seraphine as much as it seemed to please her, as though she had forgotten the shape her own voice made when it wasn't strained with sorrow. "I haven't laughed like that in longer than I can remember," Seraphine admitted, wiping at her eyes, still smiling. "Good," Ren said simply. "You should do it more often. Grief doesn't ask permission to leave room for anything else, but it also doesn't disappear just because you let yourself feel something lighter for a moment. You're allowed both." Seraphine studied her for a long moment, something warm and curious settling behind her eyes. "You have a way of saying difficult things simply. Most people either avoid the subject entirely, or drown it in so much sympathy, it becomes unbearable. I don't like unnecessary complications," Ren said. "Grief is complicated enough without people adding more to it." They talked further, about smaller things now, about the garden Seraphine used to keep before she stopped tending it, about the herbs Ren grew in her own small plot near the healer's quarters, about a particularly stubborn rose bush that Seraphine swore had a personal grudge against her. The conversation wandered easily, without the careful formality Seraphine usually maintained with visitors, without the performance of strength she felt obligated to put on for pack members who expected their Dowager Luna to remain composed at all times. It was well past when Ren had originally intended to leave when the door opened without a knock, and Cade stepped inside, clearly expecting to find his mother alone in her usual quiet stillness. He stopped just inside the doorway, and for a moment, he simply stood there, unable to fully process what he was seeing. His mother was laughing, genuinely, freely laughing, her face lit with an animation he had not seen since before his father's death, her posture loose and unguarded, in a way that had become foreign to him over the past 3 years. And across from her, perched comfortably in the chair that usually sat empty, was Ren, mid-sentence about some story involving a garden pest that apparently would not leave the rose bushes alone, no matter what remedy Seraphine tried. "Cade," Seraphine said, noticing him first, still smiling in a way that made something in his chest ache with relief and confusion in equal measure. "You're just in time. Ren was telling me about a beetle that seems to have declared war on my roses." Cade's eyes moved between his mother's bright, unguarded face and Ren's calm, unassuming expression, trying to understand how one conversation, one afternoon, had accomplished something he had failed to achieve in 3 years of trying. He had brought in healers, had suggested his mother attend gatherings, had gently pushed her toward company more times than he could count, and all of it had been met with polite refusal and quiet withdrawal. Ren had simply sat down and listened, and somehow that had been enough. "I didn't realize you'd been here so long," Cade said carefully, addressing Ren but unable to keep his eyes from drifting back to his mother's face, still lit with residual laughter. "I lost track of time," Ren admitted, standing and gathering her satchel, suddenly aware of the hour. "I should get back. Della will wonder where I've gone." "Come back tomorrow," Seraphine said, before Cade could speak, her voice carrying a hopeful eagerness that had been absent from it for years. "If you have time, I'd like to hear the end of the beetle story, and perhaps you could look at the garden with me. I haven't been out there properly in ages." Ren glanced briefly at Cade, as if silently asking whether this was permitted, though nothing in her expression suggested she needed his approval so much as basic courtesy toward the man whose mother she had just spent an hour with, uninvited. Cade found himself nodding before he had fully decided to, some instinct in him recognizing that whatever had just happened in this room was too important to interrupt with caution or suspicion, even though caution and suspicion were the only tools he had used to navigate his life for the past 3 years. "Of course," he said. "Whatever helps." Ren nodded once, said a warm goodbye to Seraphine, and left the room with the same unhurried ease she carried everywhere, leaving Cade alone with his mother for the first time in what felt like months where she did not immediately retreat into polite, exhausted silence. "She's remarkable," Seraphine said, still watching the door where Ren had disappeared. I haven't felt this much like myself in years. Cade, where did you find her? Cade did not have a simple answer for that, not one that didn't involve explaining the mate bond he had barely begun to understand himself, so he settled for something smaller, and equally true. She works with Della. I asked her to look in on you. Well, Seraphine said, a knowing look crossing her face that made Cade distinctly uncomfortable. Whatever made you think of her, I hope you have the sense to keep her close. It's been a long time since anyone in this house made me want to keep talking, rather than simply endure the conversation until it ended. He lingered a while longer, settling into the chair Wren had occupied, and for the first time in years, his mother asked him questions about his day that were not simply polite formalities, but genuine curiosity. About the border patrols, about the grain shortage in the north, about whether he was eating properly, given how thin he'd grown across the shoulders. It was such a small, ordinary thing, a mother asking after her son, and yet Cade found himself answering more openly than he had in longer than he could remember, the careful walls he kept around pack business softening slightly in the presence of her renewed attention. I worry about you, Seraphine said eventually, studying him with the same searching look she used to give him as a boy caught sneaking out past curfew. You've carried this pack alone since your father died, and I let myself disappear instead of helping you carry it. I'm sorry for that. You were grieving, Cade said. There's nothing to apologize for. Perhaps not, Seraphine allowed, but I think I forgot, somewhere in the grief, that you were grieving too, and that you didn't have the luxury of disappearing into it the way I did. You had a pack to run, and a border to defend, and I left you to do it without a mother to lean on. She reached over and took his hand, her grip stronger than it had been in years. I intend to do better, starting with that garden tomorrow, if Wren is willing to keep me company. Cade left her rooms that night with more to think about than the Voss encampment or the grain shortage, though both still weighed on him. He walked slowly through the quiet corridors toward his study, replaying the sound of his mother's laughter, trying to understand how a single conversation had loosened something in her that 3 years of his own careful effort had failed to touch. He found Rowan still awake, reviewing patrol schedules by lamplight, and dropped into the chair across from him without explanation. You look like a man who's seen a ghost, Rowan said, not looking up from his papers. I walked in on my mother laughing, Cade said. That got Rowan's attention. He set down the schedules entirely, studying his king with open surprise. Laughing. As in actually laughing? Wren was with her. They'd been talking for over an hour. About gardens, mostly. And grief. And some ridiculous story about a beetle. Cade rubbed a hand over his face, still faintly disbelieving of what he'd witnessed. I've tried everything I could think of for 3 years, Rowan. Healers, gatherings, gentle pushing toward company. None of it worked. She sat down and listened, and by the end of the hour, my mother looked like herself again. Rowan was quiet for a moment, considering this with the same careful attention he gave any serious pack matter. Some people just have that gift, he said eventually. The ability to make someone feel safe enough to actually speak, instead of just performing wellness for everyone's comfort. It's rare. Rarer still in someone so young. She didn't even seem to realize what she'd done, Cade said. She looked almost surprised when I mentioned it, like it hadn't occurred to her that an hour of ordinary conversation could matter that much. Maybe that's exactly why it worked, Rowan said. She wasn't trying to fix your mother, she was just present with her. People can tell the difference, even when they can't name it. Cade said nothing for a long while, staring into the low fire in the hearth, turning over everything that had happened since the night of the dinner. The pull of the bond, still new and disorienting. His mother's laughter, returning after years of silence. A healer's assistant who seemed entirely unbothered by his crown and entirely capable of rearranging his family's grief with nothing more than patience and honesty. I don't know what to do with her, he admitted finally, quieter than he meant to say it. Rowan allowed himself a small, knowing smile, the kind that came from watching a friend stumble into something neither of them had words for yet. You don't have to do anything with her tonight, he said. But I'd start getting used to the idea that she's not going anywhere, Cade. Not after what I just heard. Whatever she did for your mother today, she did it without trying to earn your favor, without asking for anything in return. That's not something you find twice in a lifetime. Cade left the study that night, with his mind still circling the same unanswered question, one that no border report or council meeting could resolve for him. He left his mother's rooms that evening, lighter than he had felt in years, and infinitely more unsettled about what, exactly, Ren Callahan was quietly rearranging in his carefully ordered world. Cade found Ren the next afternoon in the small garden behind the healer's quarters, kneeling in the dirt with her sleeves pushed up, separating seedlings into neat rows with the same careful attention she gave everything else. He had told himself he was there to discuss the Border Patrol schedules, though the patrol schedules had been settled for 2 days and required no further conversation at all. "You're supposed to be at the Eastern Camp by now," Ren said without looking up, apparently having sensed him approaching before he'd said a word. "Della mentioned you wanted a healer stationed there by midweek." "That's handled," Cade said. "I'm here about something else." Ren sat back on her heels, wiping dirt from her hands onto her apron, and looked up at him with the same open, unhurried patience she seemed to carry into every conversation. "All right. What's on your mind, my king?" The formality of the title landed oddly between them now, after everything he'd seen the day before, and Cade found himself wishing, briefly and uncomfortably, that she would simply say his name instead. He did not ask her to. Instead, he got straight to the point that had kept him awake half the night. "You spent over an hour with my mother yesterday," he said, "talking about grief, about things she hasn't spoken about with anyone since my father died." "I did," Ren agreed, unbothered by the observation, waiting for whatever concern lay beneath it. "I need to understand your intentions," Cade said, and heard, even as the words left his mouth, how stiff and formal they sounded, more suited to a diplomatic negotiation than a conversation about his own mother's well-being. "My mother is fragile right now. I won't have her grief used as a way into this family, or into my favor." Ren's expression did not shift into hurt or defensiveness the way he half expected. Instead, something colder and more measured crossed her face, the look of someone recalibrating her opinion of a person in real time. "You think I sat with a grieving woman for an hour, listening to her talk about her dead husband, as some sort of strategy? I think people find their way into royal favor through all sorts of doors," Cade said, though even as he said it, he heard how poorly it matched what he'd actually witnessed the day before. "I've seen it before. Nobles who court my mother's sympathy to gain influence with me." "I'm not a noble," Ren said, standing now, brushing the last of the dirt from her knees, her voice still calm, but edged with something sharper underneath. "I didn't seek out your mother, my king. Della assigned me because your patrol reshuffling left her schedule full. I brought remedies for a headache and stayed because your mother wanted someone to talk to, and because I know what it feels like to grieve alone in a house full of people who are too afraid to ask how you're really doing. That's not strategy. That's just decency." "You understand why I'd want to be careful," Cade said, though his conviction was already beginning to waver under the plain honesty in her voice. "I understand you're the king, and you've probably had reason to distrust people's motives before," Ren said. "What I don't understand is why you'd bring that distrust to me after watching your mother laugh for the first time in years, instead of simply being grateful that she had a good afternoon. If you wanted to warn me off, you could have done it before I ever set foot in her rooms. Instead, you're doing it after, which makes it feel less like protecting her and more like protecting yourself from whatever it is you're afraid I might want from you." The words landed harder than Cade expected, partly because they were true, and partly because no one had spoken to him with this much unguarded directness in longer than he could remember. He was used to advisors who softened their disagreements, warriors who deferred, even when they thought him wrong, nobles who wrapped every criticism in careful diplomatic language. Ren offered none of that cushioning, and the absence of it left him strangely exposed. "That isn't what this is," he said, though even to his own ears it sounded less certain than he intended. "Then what is it?" Ren asked, crossing her arms, waiting. Cade did not have an answer that he was willing to give her yet, not one that involved explaining the mate bond that had knocked the breath from his chest the moment he first saw her, not one that acknowledged how much of his sudden caution stemmed from the terrifying realization that this woman could unravel more of his carefully built control than any border threat ever had. So he said nothing, and the silence stretched long enough that Ren's expression shifted from sharp to simply tired. "I don't know what you think I'm after," she said finally, quieter now. "I don't want your favor. I don't want a title, or gifts, or a place at your table. I have work I care about, and a quiet life I've built for myself, and I'd genuinely rather go back to both of those things than spend my afternoons defending my character to a king who apparently can't tell the difference between kindness and ambition." She turned back to her seedlings, effectively ending the conversation without raising her voice or storming off, simply returning to her work the way she had at the training yard, the way she seemed to return to everything that mattered more to her than court politics. Cade stood there for a long moment, watching her hands move carefully through the soil, feeling the conversation slip away from him in a direction he had not intended and did not know how to correct. "I overstepped," he said finally. Wren did not look up immediately, though her hands stilled slightly over the seedlings. "Yes," she agreed, "you did. My mother has been unwell for a long time," Cade said, trying again, choosing his words more carefully this time. "I've watched people use her grief before, in small ways, political ways, and I didn't want to see it happen again. That doesn't excuse what I said to you, but it's the truth of where it came from." Wren considered this for a moment, and some of the sharpness left her posture, though she did not immediately soften back into the easy warmth he'd seen with his mother and with Hollis at the training yard. "I understand wanting to protect her," she said. "I don't understand assuming the worst about someone before giving them a chance to prove otherwise. If you'd asked me yesterday why I stayed so long, I would have told you plainly. You didn't ask. You accused." "I'm asking now," Cade said. She studied him for a long moment, weighing something, and then finally answered, her voice steady again. "I stayed because she needed someone to listen without flinching, and because I know what that particular kind of loneliness feels like from the inside. That's the whole of it. There's no strategy underneath it, my king, no matter how much your instincts want to find one. Not my king. Not from you." Something in Wren's expression shifted at that, a small crack in the careful composure she'd maintained through the entire exchange, though she covered it quickly, returning her attention to the seedlings still waiting to be planted. "Fine," she said. "Cade, I'd like to get back to my garden now, if there's nothing else." "There isn't," he said, though it felt like a lie, even as he said it, because there was a great deal else he wanted to say to her, none of which he was ready to put into words. He left her kneeling in the dirt among her seedlings, and walked back toward the castle feeling, for the second time in a week, that he had badly misjudged a situation that had nothing to do with strategy or threat, and everything to do with a woman who simply did not operate by any of the rules he had spent his life learning to navigate. Back in the healer's quarters that evening, Wren found her friend Nora sorting bandages by the window, humming quietly to herself, and dropped onto the bench beside her, with more force than the moment required. "You look like you've been arguing with someone important," Nora said, not looking up from her work. Nora had trained alongside Wren for 2 years, and had developed an unfair talent for reading her moods from across a room. "The king," Wren said. Nora's hands stilled entirely. "The king, as in Alpha King Cade Ashgrove. That king. He accused me of using his mother's grief to worm my way into royal favor," Wren said, still faintly indignant even hours later. "As if I have any interest whatsoever in royal favor. As if I don't have enough to do without needing to invent a scheme around an afternoon of conversation." "What did you say to him?" Nora asked, setting the bandages aside entirely now, giving Wren her full attention. "I told him the truth, that I stayed because his mother needed someone to listen, and that I know what that kind of grief feels like. And I told him he was projecting his own suspicion onto someone who'd done nothing to earn it." Wren pulled her knees up onto the bench, wrapping her arms around them, some of her earlier sharpness fading into simple tiredness. He apologized, eventually, sort of. It still stung. Nora studied her for a long moment, an odd, careful expression crossing her face. "Wren, has anything strange happened around the king lately? Any odd feeling? Anything you can't quite explain?" Wren frowned, caught off guard by the question. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Nora said carefully, choosing her words the way one might approach a skittish animal, "that alpha wolves don't typically summon healers' assistants to the throne room to discuss patrol schedules that have already been settled, and they don't usually confront someone directly about spending time with their mother, unless something else is going on underneath it." "What are you suggesting?" Wren asked, though something uneasy was already stirring in her chest, a half-formed suspicion she hadn't let herself examine too closely. "I'm suggesting," Nora said gently, "that you might want to consider whether the king of the Ashgrove pack has found his mate, and whether that mate might be sitting on this bench right now, completely unaware of it." Wren opened her mouth to argue, to point out how absurd the idea sounded, and then stopped. Because absurd as it sounded, It also explained things that had not quite made sense to her before. The way he'd stopped mid-conversation at the dinner, staring at her, as though she'd become the only person in the room. The strange excuse to summon her to the throne room over patrol assignments that Della could have answered easily. The way he'd shown up at his mother's rooms and stood frozen in the doorway, rather than simply greeting them both. The confrontation today, sharp and defensive in a way that made far more sense, if he were afraid of losing control over something he didn't yet understand, rather than genuinely suspicious of her motives. "That's ridiculous," Ren said, though her voice lacked conviction even to her own ears. "Is it?" Nora asked. "You've told me yourself he's summoned you twice in 1 week, for reasons that don't hold up under any scrutiny. You've told me he stood in his mother's doorway like he'd seen a ghost. And now he's confronting you about spending an afternoon being kind to a grieving woman, which is the single most suspicious thing an Alpha King would do only if some deeper instinct in him were already reacting to you in ways he doesn't understand yet." Ren sat with that for a long moment, staring at the window without really seeing it, turning over every strange interaction of the past week with new and uncomfortable clarity. She thought of the way his eyes had followed her at the dinner, sharp and searching in a way that had nothing to do with polite curiosity. She thought of the low, careful tone in his voice when he'd said her name, instead of her title in the garden, the small crack in his composure that he'd tried and failed to hide. "Even if you're right," Ren said slowly, "it doesn't change anything. I'm not a noble woman. I don't know the first thing about running a pack, or managing court politics, or being a Luna. Whatever instinct is pulling at him, it doesn't mean I'm equipped to be what he needs. That's not really how it works, from what I understand," Nora said, not unkindly. "The bond doesn't ask permission, and it doesn't care about qualifications. It just happens, and then two people have to figure out what to do with it." "Well," Ren said, standing abruptly, suddenly needing to move, rather than sit still with the weight of the conversation. "He can figure it out on his own time. I have seedlings to finish planting, and a headache remedy to prepare for one of the Border Patrol scouts, and none of that has anything to do with mate bonds or thrones or any of the rest of it." Nora let her go without further argument, though the look she gave Ren as she left carried a quiet, knowing patience, the look of someone who suspected the matter was far from settled no matter how firmly Ren tried to close the door on it. Ren returned to her small garden in the fading evening light, kneeling once more among her half-planted seedlings, and found that her hands, usually so steady and sure in this work, trembled slightly as she pressed soil around the fragile roots, her mind circling endlessly back to a king who apparently could not decide whether to push her away or pull her closer, and to the uncomfortable, undeniable truth that some part of her did not want him to choose the former. He did not see her again that day, though he thought about the conversation more than any border report deserved, replaying the sharp, unflinching honesty in her voice, and finding, uncomfortably, that he respected her more for it rather than less. Within 2 weeks, the change in the Dowager Luna had become impossible for anyone in the castle to ignore. Seraphine Ashgrove, who had spent 3 years retreating further into her private wing with each passing season, began appearing at the morning meal again, seated at the long table, with color in her cheeks, and genuine interest in the conversations happening around her. The staff noticed first, exchanging quiet, hopeful glances whenever she asked after their families, or complimented the kitchen's bread, small kindnesses she had once offered freely, and had let fall silent since her husband's death. Ren visited most afternoons now, no longer under any official assignment from Della, simply because Seraphine asked for her by name, and Ren found she did not mind the asking. Together they had revived the garden behind the Dowager's wing, pulling weeds from beds that had gone untended for years, replanting rows of lavender and chamomile that Seraphine remembered planting with her own mother decades earlier. The work seemed to steady something in her, gave her hands purpose again, the way grief had stolen it from her for so long. "You've done more for her in 2 weeks than 3 years of physicians managed," Della told Ren one morning, watching Seraphine laugh with 2 of the kitchen staff across the courtyard, a sound that still drew curious glances from anyone who remembered how silent that laugh had been. "I don't know what you're doing, but keep doing it." "I'm not doing anything special," Ren said, though she said it without full conviction, aware that whatever was happening between her and Seraphine ran deeper than simple friendliness. "I just listen, and I don't let her pretend she's fine when she isn't." "That's rarer than you think," Della said. "Most people, even healers, want to fix grief quickly, so they can stop feeling uncomfortable around it. You just sit with it. That's a gift, whether you call it one or not. The change reached its most visible point on the day Seraphine attended a full pack council session for the first time since her husband's death, taking a seat near the back of the chamber rather than her old place beside the throne, but present nonetheless, listening with sharp attention to discussions of the border situation and the grain shortage in the northern villages. Cade nearly stumbled over his own words when he saw her settle into the chair, so unused to her presence in that room that for a moment he forgot what he had been saying to his assembled advisors. "Don't let me interrupt," Seraphine said, an amused glint in her eye that reminded several of the older council members sharply of the woman she had been before grief hollowed her out. "I simply wanted to hear how my son is running things these days. It's been too long since I paid proper attention." The elders exchanged glances, some clearly delighted, a few more cautious, uncertain what her sudden reappearance in pack matters might mean for the careful balance of influence they had settled into during her absence. Cade caught the wariness in a few faces and understood immediately what it meant. His mother's return to public life was not simply a personal joy, it was a political shift, and not everyone in that room welcomed it equally. After the session ended, one of the senior advisors, a sharp-eyed man named Elias who had served the pack for over 20 years, approached Cade privately in the corridor, his expression carefully neutral in the way Cade had learned meant trouble was coming. "It's good to see the Dowager well again," Elias said, in the tone of a man laying careful groundwork before the actual point of his visit. "Though I wonder, my king, whether it's wise to let a servant girl have this much influence over the Dowager Luna's daily life. People are beginning to talk." "Talk about what, exactly?" Cade said, his voice going flat and cold, in a way that made Elias choose his next words with visible care. "About a healer's assistant, with no lineage, no standing, and apparently unlimited access to the royal family," Elias said. "About what it might mean if she's positioning herself for something greater than tending gardens. Forgive my bluntness, my king, but ambitious people have used far smaller openings than the one this girl currently holds." Cade felt something sharp and possessive coil in his chest at the accusation, a reaction so immediate and visceral that it startled even him. He thought of Wren kneeling in the dirt among her seedlings, her plain and unhurried honesty, the complete absence of calculation in everything she said and did. The idea of her scheming for position struck him as almost laughably wrong, and yet he understood, with the cold clarity of a man who had navigated court politics for years, exactly how this would look to anyone who did not know her the way he was beginning to. "She has done more for my mother in 2 weeks than every physician and advisor in this castle managed in 3 years, Cade said, his voice carrying enough warning that Elias visibly recalibrated his approach. "If people are talking, they can direct their concerns to me directly, rather than spreading suspicion in the corridors." "Of course, my king," Elias said, bowing slightly, though the careful, measuring look in his eyes did not fully disappear. "I only wish to bring the matter to your attention before it grew larger than a simple conversation." Cade watched him go, unease settling into his chest, despite his firm defense of Wren. He knew how quickly whispers could calcify into accepted truth within a pack, how easily suspicion could poison something as simple as kindness, if left unchecked. He found Rowan later that evening and relayed the conversation, watching his friend's expression darken with the same concern. "Elias isn't wrong that people are talking," Rowan admitted. "I've heard similar murmurs myself. Nothing serious yet. Mostly curiosity mixed with a bit of jealousy from those who'd hoped to gain the Dowager's favor themselves. But it could turn uglier, if it's allowed to sit unaddressed." "She's done nothing wrong," Cade said. "I know that," Rowan said. "You know that. But perception moves faster than truth in a pack this size, and you know as well as I do that Garrick's spies are always listening for exactly this kind of opening. A rumor about an ambitious healer with too much access to the royal family is exactly the sort of thing he could twist into something far uglier, especially now that he knows the border tensions have your full attention." The mention of Garrick settled into Cade like a stone, a reminder that the quiet joy of his mother's recovery existed alongside a very real and growing threat along his eastern border. He had let himself become distracted these past 2 weeks, caught between managing patrol reports and finding excuses to walk past the garden where Wren tended her seedlings, and the reminder that Garrick was still watching, still waiting for weakness, snapped something back into sharper focus. "I won't let rumors decide who deserves protection in my own castle. Cade said finally. But I'll be more careful about how visible her time with my mother becomes, until this settles. Rowan nodded slowly, though his expression remained thoughtful. For what it's worth, he said, I don't think caution will fix this the way you're hoping. People who want to see ambition and kindness will find it no matter how quietly it happens. The only thing that actually changes minds is time, and proof, and you standing firmly behind her when it matters. Quietness just gives the rumors room to grow in the dark. Cade said nothing to that, though the words lingered with him long after Rowan left, echoing uncomfortably alongside the memory of his mother's laughter, of Wren's steady hands in the garden soil, of the sharp honesty in her voice, the day he'd wrongly accused her of exactly the ambition Elias now suspected. He thought of how furious she would be to learn that her kindness toward a grieving woman had somehow transformed, in the mouths of careful courtiers, into a political maneuver, and he found himself dreading the moment he would have to tell her. The rumors reached Wren herself 2 days later, delivered without malice, but with obvious discomfort by Nora, who had overheard 2 kitchen maids discussing the matter while sorting linens. They're saying you've set your sights on the crown, Nora said, watching Wren's face carefully for a reaction. That you've charmed the Dowager Luna so thoroughly because you're angling for a place beside the king himself. I told them it was nonsense, but you know how these things spread. Wren set down the mortar and pestle she'd been using to grind dried chamomile, her jaw tightening with a frustration she rarely let show so plainly. I spend my afternoons pulling weeds and listening to a grieving woman talk about her garden. That's the whole of my ambition, apparently reinterpreted as a plot to seize a throne I have never once expressed any interest in. I know, Nora said gently, but you should know it's spreading, and not just among the kitchen staff. Elias has apparently mentioned it to the king directly. The news landed harder than Wren expected, a hot flush of humiliation and anger rising in her chest at the thought of being discussed and dissected by advisors who had never spoken 2 words to her, who knew nothing of her mother's death, or her years of careful, unglamorous training under Della, reducing all of it to a scheme for power she had never once wanted. She thought of Seraphine's genuine laughter in the garden, the fragile trust they had built together over shared grief and quiet afternoons, and felt a fierce, protective anger on behalf of a friendship that owed nothing to anyone's suspicion. I should stop visiting her, Wren said, the words tasting bitter even as she said them. If my presence is causing this kind of talk, it isn't worth the trouble it's bringing to the royal family. Don't you dare, Nora said, sharper than Wren had ever heard her friend speak. You've done more good for that woman in a month than anyone else managed in 3 years. Don't let a handful of jealous courtiers take that away from her, because they can't imagine kindness existing without an agenda underneath it. Wren did not have an answer for that, though the thought of abandoning Seraphine, of leaving her to retreat back into the silence she had only just begun to escape, felt like its own kind of cruelty, one she was not willing to commit regardless of what rumors swirled around the castle corridors. She found Seraphine in the garden that afternoon as usual, kneeling among the lavender with dirt already staining the knees of her fine dress, utterly unbothered by any concern for propriety that might once have kept her indoors and composed. Wren hesitated at the garden gate, uncertain how to raise the subject of rumors without sounding as though she were fishing for reassurance, but Seraphine noticed her hesitation immediately and set down her trowel. Something's troubling you, Seraphine said. Tell me. There's talk, Wren admitted, choosing honesty over evasion, the way she always did, that I'm spending time with you for the wrong reasons, that I'm angling for influence, or worse, for a place beside your son. Seraphine's expression did not shift into alarm or doubt the way Wren had half feared. Instead, something fierce and protective settled over her features, an echo of the formidable Luna she must have been years ago, before grief had dulled her edges. Let them talk, she said simply. I have known plenty of ambitious people in my time at this court, Wren. I know exactly what ambition looks like, the careful flattery, the strategic questions, the way such people always find a reason to mention their own worth in every conversation. You have never once done any of that. You've asked about my roses more than you've ever asked about my son's throne. It still bothers me, Wren admitted. That kindness gets reinterpreted as scheming, simply because I don't have the right lineage to explain it any other way. That says far more about the people spreading the rumor than it does about you, Seraphine said firmly. And if my son has any sense at all, which I admit is sometimes in question, given how long he took to notice his own mother was drowning in grief right under his nose, He will make it very clear to his court that such talk is unwelcome. She reached over and squeezed Ren's hand, dirt and all. I will not let anyone's suspicion take away the first real friendship I've had in years. Let them whisper. I know the truth, and so does anyone with eyes to see how much lighter I've felt since you started visiting. The reassurance settled some of the tightness in Ren's chest, though it did not entirely erase the discomfort of knowing that somewhere in the castle, advisors and courtiers were weighing her character, in rooms she would never be invited into, deciding her worth based on assumptions rather than any actual conversation with her. She thought, unwillingly, of Cade, wondering whether he had defended her the way his mother just had, or whether he had let the whispers sit unanswered, out of the same caution that had made him accuse her so unfairly in the garden weeks before. That night, walking the corridor outside his mother's wing, he heard Seraphine's voice, drifting through a half-open door, warm and unguarded, as she thanked Ren for another afternoon spent among the lavender beds, and he stood there for a long moment in the dark, torn between the fierce instinct to protect what this friendship had restored in his mother, and the growing dread that protecting it might mean standing against forces far larger and more dangerous than a handful of whispering advisors. Cade had never considered himself a man ruled by indecision, but the weeks following Elias's warning left him circling the same argument with himself so often that even Rowan had begun losing patience with the repetition. Every instinct he possessed as Alpha King told him to manage the situation the way he managed every threat to pack stability, cleanly, quietly, with minimal exposure. That meant limiting Ren's visibility, perhaps asking her to visit his mother less publicly, perhaps waiting out the rumors until they lost momentum on their own. Every instinct he possessed, as a man who had watched his mother return to life after 3 years of grief, told him that any version of that plan was a betrayal of the one person who had done more good for his family than anyone else at court, simply by being honest and present in a way no one else had managed. He found himself standing outside the garden more often than he could justify with any real excuse, watching Ren work the soil beside his mother, listening to the two of them talk about nothing important, and feeling something in his chest ache with a wanting he did not fully understand and could not fully control. It was not simply the mate bond, though the bond made itself known constantly now, a low, insistent pull whenever she was near, and an uncomfortable hollow ache whenever she was not. It was something quieter underneath the bond, an admiration that had nothing to do with instinct, and everything to do with who she actually was. "You're doing it again," Seraphine said one afternoon, catching him lingering at the garden gate with an expression she clearly found amusing, staring like a boy too nervous to say hello. "I'm not staring," Cade said, though the denial came a full second too late to be convincing. "Cade," his mother said, setting down her trowel and giving him the particular look she used to give him as a child, when he'd tried and failed to talk his way out of some minor mischief. "I raised you. I know exactly what a besotted man looks like, and you have looked like one for weeks now. Why haven't you told her?" "Told her what?" Cade said, though he knew precisely what his mother meant, and had no genuine hope of deflecting the question. "That she's your mate," Seraphine said plainly. No hesitation in the words at all. "I may have been buried in grief these past years, Cade, but I haven't lost my ability to notice when my son has finally found the one person who makes him stand a little straighter, a little softer around the eyes, whenever she's nearby. Ren deserves to know what she means to you, rather than being left to guess at why the king keeps hovering at garden gates like a nervous suitor." Cade said nothing for a long moment, watching Ren kneel further down the row, entirely unaware that she was the subject of this conversation. "She has enough to contend with already," he said finally. "Elias's rumors, the whispers among the staff. If I tell her about the bond now, it will look like exactly the kind of scheme people already suspect her of running. I won't hand my enemies that weapon." "Or," Seraphine said, gentler now, "you're afraid of what happens if you tell her, and she doesn't want what the bond is asking of both of you. Being honest with yourself might do you some good, Cade. You've spent 3 years building walls around every soft part of yourself because it was easier than feeling anything too deeply after your father died. I understand that instinct better than anyone. But walls that keep out grief also keep out everything else worth having." The observation landed with uncomfortable precision, close enough to the truth that Cade found he had no ready argument against it. He had told himself the delay was strategy, careful management of a delicate political situation. But beneath that reasoning sat something smaller, and more honest. A fear that Ren, who had never once shown any interest in crowns or titles, or the particular gravity of being an Alpha King's mate, might simply decide the whole arrangement was more trouble than it was worth. And there's the matter of grandchildren, of course, Seraphine added, with the particular mischief of a mother who knew exactly how to needle her son when a conversation grew too heavy for comfort. Mother, Cade said, something between exasperation and reluctant amusement in his voice. I'm simply saying, Seraphine continued, entirely unbothered by his tone, that this house has been far too quiet for far too long, and I would very much like to hear small feet running these halls again, before I grow too old to chase after them properly. Ren would make a wonderful mother, Cade. She has more patience than anyone I've ever met, and she doesn't coddle, which is exactly what any child of yours will need, given how stubborn you were as a boy. We are nowhere near that conversation, Cade said, though the image his mother had conjured lingered longer than he expected, unwelcome and warm in equal measure, a life he had not let himself imagine in years of border reports and council meetings, and careful, guarded solitude. Not yet, Seraphine agreed. No, but you'll get there faster if you stop treating your own feelings like a border threat to be managed, rather than a gift to be embraced. Cade left the garden that day without speaking to Ren at all, retreating instead into the more familiar territory of council business, where at least he understood the rules of engagement. But his mother's words followed him through the rest of the afternoon, through a tense meeting about grain reserves and a longer, more contentious discussion about increasing patrols along the Voss border, in response to continued strange movements from Garrick's camps. Elias raised the matter of Ren again during that meeting, more carefully this time, framing his concern as one of pack stability, rather than direct accusation. My king, I only raise it because the rumors have not settled as we'd hoped. Some of the older families are beginning to ask whether the Dowager Luna's closeness with this healer's assistant reflects any deeper arrangement. If there is truth to it, it might be wiser to address it directly, rather than let speculation continue unchecked. Cade felt the weight of every eye in the chamber settle on him, waiting for an answer he was not yet ready to give in full, though he understood, watching Elias's careful, patient expression, that avoiding the question entirely would only feed the very speculation he was trying to starve. The Dowager Luna's friendships are her own business, Cade said finally, his voice carrying the flat authority that ended most arguments in that chamber before they truly began. Anyone who continues to spread suspicion about a woman who has done nothing but bring genuine care into this castle will answer to me directly. I trust that's clear enough for everyone present. The room fell silent, and Elias inclined his head in careful acknowledgement, though the measuring look in his eyes did not fully disappear, a reminder that a single firm statement in council would not be enough to fully quiet whatever suspicions had already taken root among the older families. Cade left the meeting with the uncomfortable sense that he had bought himself time rather than resolution, and that the deeper truth of the bond, once it became known, would either silence every whisper for good, or hand his enemies exactly the weapon he had been trying so carefully to avoid giving them. He tried once, 2 nights later, to say it plainly. He found Ren finishing her rounds near the healer's quarters, the evening quiet enough that no one else lingered in the corridor to overhear, and he stood in front of her, with every intention of finally putting words to the thing that had kept him awake for weeks. There's something I need to tell you, he said, and something in his voice must have carried more weight than usual, because Ren set down the basket of clean linens she'd been carrying, and gave him her full attention immediately. All right, she said, waiting, patient as always. Cade opened his mouth, the words mate and bond sitting right at the edge of his tongue, ready to be spoken, and found himself hesitating at the last possible moment, some old, stubborn instinct warning him that once said, the words could not be unsaid, and that Ren, who had never once shown interest in crowns or titles, might simply look at him with the same calm, unimpressed patience she gave everything else, and tell him this changed nothing for her at all. The rumors about you and my mother, he said instead, the words shifting course before he could stop them. I addressed them in council today. I made it clear that anyone spreading suspicion about you would answer to me directly. Something in Ren's expression softened, genuine gratitude replacing the wary tiredness she'd carried for days now. Thank you, she said. That means more than you probably realize. You shouldn't have to carry the weight of other people's suspicion, simply for being kind to a grieving woman, Cade said, and meant every word of it. even as some smaller, more honest part of him recognized that he had once again talked around the actual truth, rather than through it. "No," Ren agreed, "I shouldn't. But I appreciate you saying so, all the same." She studied him for a moment longer, something curious in her expression, as though she sensed there was more beneath his words than he'd let himself say. "Was that all you wanted to tell me?" "That was all," Cade said, and hated himself slightly for the lie of omission even as he said it. Ren nodded, accepting the answer at face value, though the curious look lingered a moment longer before she picked her basket back up and continued toward the healer's quarters, leaving Cade alone in the corridor with the words he had failed, once again, to say. He found Rowan later that night, reviewing new reports from the Eastern Ridge, and dropped heavily into the chair across from him, frustrated with himself, in a way that had nothing to do with pack business at all. "I couldn't do it," Cade admitted, before Rowan even had the chance to ask. "Tell her about the bond," Rowan guessed, not looking up from the reports. "I got as far as opening my mouth," Cade said, "and then I told her about the council meeting instead, about Elias, about anything except the one thing that actually matters." Rowan set the reports down, giving his friend a long, appraising look. "You've fought border skirmishes without flinching. You've stood in front of hostile pack envoys and never once shown fear. And you can't tell one woman that she's your mate." "It's not the same," Cade said. "No," Rowan agreed. "It's harder. Border skirmishes only risk your life. This risks something you clearly care about, a great deal more than that." He hesitated, then added, more seriously, "For what it's worth, I don't think you have the luxury of waiting much longer. Garrick's patrols pulled back from the ridge 3 weeks ago and haven't moved since, which means he's either lost interest, which I doubt, or he's planning something and waiting for the right moment. If tensions rise along the border while rumors are still swirling about the Dowager's companion, Garrick will use both against you at once if he can. He's clever enough to see an opening in a divided court just as easily as he sees one in a weak patrol line." The warning settled uncomfortably alongside everything else weighing on Cade's mind. Another thread pulling taut in a situation that already felt like it was fraying at every edge. He thought of Ren, in the garden with his mother, unaware of the political weight her simple kindness now carried, unaware of the bond that made her, whether she wanted it or not, the single most important target any enemy of his pack could hope to exploit. "I'll tell her," Cade said finally, more to himself than to Rowan. "Soon. Before anything else forces the truth out into the open, before I've had the chance to say it properly." "Good," Rowan said, "because I'd rather she hear it from you, in your own words, than have Garrick or Elias, or anyone else decide the timing for you." Cade left the study that night carrying the weight of that warning alongside his mother's earlier words, 2 different voices, urging him toward the same uncomfortable conclusion, that whatever fear kept him circling the truth rather than speaking it plainly, was a luxury he could no longer afford, not with Garrick's silence growing more ominous by the day, and not with a woman in his garden who deserved to know exactly what she had already become to him, long before anyone else decided to tell her first. That evening, alone in his study, he found himself thinking not of Garrick's encampments or Elias's careful maneuvering, but of his mother's question, asked so plainly it had left him without a ready defense. "Why haven't you told her?" He did not have a good answer, only the growing, uncomfortable awareness that every day he delayed was a day he spent letting fear masquerade as caution, and that whatever was coming for his pack, from Garrick's border, or from the whispers already circling his own court, would not wait for him to find his courage on his own schedule. The first sign that Garrick had turned his attention from the border to the court itself arrived in the form of a traveling merchant who set up in the pack's market square, claiming to carry rare fabrics from the southern territories. Rowan grew suspicious within a day, noting that the man asked far more questions about the royal family than any merchant needed to, and by the time his suspicions reached Cade, the merchant had already vanished from the market, leaving behind nothing but a trail of careful, pointed conversations with anyone willing to gossip about the Dowager Luna's new companion. Within a week, the rumors that had been simmering quietly among a handful of jealous courtiers exploded into something far larger and more dangerous, carried on currents that Cade recognized immediately as too coordinated to be simple gossip. Whispers claimed Ren had bewitched the Dowager Luna with charmed remedies. Others suggested she was a spy planted by a rival pack to gather information through the royal family's trust. Still others, more cruel and more calculated, suggested that a woman of her low standing could never truly be fit to stand beside an alpha king, that her presence in the castle was an embarrassment the pack should address before it grew into something worse. Cade traced the pattern back to Garrick's involvement within days, the careful cruelty of the rumors bearing all the hallmarks of a rival alpha who understood that a divided court was as dangerous as a breached border. Garrick could not attack Ashgrove Pack directly without provoking open war, not yet, not while Cade's warriors stood ready along the ridge. But a court fractured by suspicion, an alpha king distracted by scandal, a Dowager Luna's reputation quietly tarnished through association. All of that weakened Ashgrove Pack just as effectively as an army, and cost Garrick nothing but a few well-placed whispers. The situation came to a head during a formal council session, attended by representatives from 3 neighboring packs, gathered to discuss a shared response to Garrick's increasingly aggressive posturing along multiple borders. Cade had not intended for Wren's name to arise at all in a meeting meant to address matters of collective defense, but one of the visiting envoys, a cold-eyed man from a smaller pack that had long courted favor with Garrick, raised the matter with deliberate, needling precision. "Forgive my bluntness, my king," the envoy said, "but before we discuss matters of shared defense, several of us have heard concerning rumors about instability within your own court. A servant girl with undue influence over the Dowager Luna, rumors of spying, of manipulation. It seems unwise to coordinate strategy with a pack whose own house may not be in order." The chamber fell silent, every advisor and elder present watching Cade with the particular tension of people waiting to see how their king would handle a direct public challenge. Cade felt the old, familiar cold settle over him, the same discipline that had carried him through every border crisis of his reign, and beneath it, something fiercer and far less controlled, a protective fury that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with the woman being discussed, as though she were a piece on someone else's game board. "The rumors you've heard," Cade said, his voice carrying evenly across the chamber, "originated with a merchant who spent a single week in my market square, asking pointed questions about my family, before vanishing without a trace. I would be very interested to know, envoy, how word of a rumor manufactured in my own territory reached your pack so quickly, unless someone made a particular effort to ensure it did." The envoy's composure flickered, just slightly, enough for several of the sharper-eyed elders in the room to notice. "I only repeat what I've heard, my king. I meant no offense." "Then hear this instead," Cade said, standing now, his voice dropping into the low, absolute authority that had once made seasoned warriors lower their eyes without thinking, though this time, the words carried more conviction than any command he had given in years. "The woman you're referring to is Wren Callahan, healer's assistant to this pack, and she has done more genuine good for my family in a matter of weeks than any noble in this room managed in years of careful political courtship. She is not a spy. She is not manipulating my mother. She is, in fact, my mate, bonded to me the moment I first saw her, and I will not stand in my own council chamber and listen to her character dismantled by whispers, manufactured by an enemy too cowardly to challenge me directly." The words landed with the force of a thrown stone, ripples of shocked silence spreading through the chamber, as every advisor, elder, and visiting envoy absorbed the declaration at once. Elias's expression shifted through several states of surprise, before settling into something more careful, recalculating instantly the political weight of what had just been announced. Rowan, standing near the back of the room, allowed himself the smallest, most satisfied smile, the look of a man who had waited weeks for exactly this moment. "My king," the envoy said carefully, clearly recalibrating his own position, now that the matter had shifted from court gossip to a formal, public claim of mateship, which carried weight and consequence far beyond simple rumor. "I did not realize the circumstances. My apologies, to you and to the Dowager Luna both. See that your pack understands the truth of it going forward," Cade said, "and see that whatever source fed you these rumors understands that I know exactly where they originated and exactly what purpose they were meant to serve." The meeting continued after that, shifting back toward the matter of collective border defense, but the air in the chamber had changed entirely. Every advisor and elder present now recalculating not just their opinion of Wren, but the entire political landscape her position as mate to the Alpha King had just rearranged. Elias, cornered afterward in the corridor, offered Cade a stiff, careful bow. "I owe the healer an apology, it seems. Elias said, though his tone carried more caution than warmth. I raised concerns in good faith, my king, believing I was protecting the pack's stability. I did not realize the deeper truth of the matter. See that you offer that apology directly to her, Cade said, and see that any future concerns about her character come to me first, rather than spreading through the corridors before I've had the chance to address them. Elias bowed again and withdrew, leaving Cade alone, with the full weight of what he had just done. He had not planned to declare the bond publicly, had intended, right up until the moment the envoy's needling comment lit something fierce and unguarded in his chest, to tell Ren privately, carefully, in his own time and his own words. Instead, the truth had spilled out in the middle of a crowded council chamber, in front of visiting envoys and skeptical elders, without Ren ever having heard it from him first at all. The realization struck him with sudden, sick clarity as he left the chamber. Word would travel through the castle within the hour, carried by advisors and staff who had witnessed the declaration firsthand, and Ren, who deserved to hear something this important spoken gently and privately, was about to learn of her own fate as his mate through castle gossip rather than from the man who loved her. Cade moved through the corridors faster than dignity strictly allowed, desperate to reach the healer's quarters before rumor beat him there. But even as he walked, he could already hear the murmur of voices rippling ahead of him, servants pausing mid-task to whisper to one another, the particular electric hum of a castle, absorbing enormous news all at once. He rounded the final corner toward the garden just in time to see Ren standing frozen near the lavender beds, Nora beside her with an expression caught somewhere between shock and barely contained excitement, and understood, with a fresh wave of dread, that he was already too late. Ren, he said, stopping a short distance away, suddenly unsure, for the first time in longer than he could remember, of exactly what to say. Nora, Ren said quietly, without looking away from Cade, could you give us a moment? Nora withdrew immediately, though not without a final glance at Cade that carried more warning than any words could have managed. Once she was gone, Ren crossed her arms, studying him with an expression that had settled somewhere between hurt and disbelief. I heard it from 3 different people before you even made it to the garden, she said. A council session with visiting envoys. That's where I find out I'm your mate. Not from you, quietly, in private, the way any decent person would tell someone something this enormous. From gossip traveling faster than you could walk here yourself. That isn't how I meant for this to happen, Cade said, and heard how weak it sounded even as he said it. Then how did you mean for it to happen? Ren asked, her voice sharper now, the careful composure she carried into every conversation, finally cracking under the weight of genuine hurt. How long have you known? Cade hesitated, and that hesitation alone told her everything, before he'd said a single word. Since the dinner, he admitted quietly, the first night, when you were delivering remedies for the kitchen staff. Ren's arms tightened around herself, something in her expression shifting from hurt toward something colder, more guarded. Weeks, she said. You've known for weeks. You summoned me to the throne room under a false reason. You accused me of scheming against your mother in that garden. And this entire time, you knew exactly why you couldn't stop watching me, and you said nothing. I was trying to protect you, Cade said. The rumors were already circling before I ever considered telling you. I didn't want to hand Elias, or anyone else, the exact weapon they were looking for. You didn't protect me, Ren said. You made the decision for me, about my own life, without ever once asking what I might want to know, or when I might want to know it. And then you announced it to a room full of strangers before you ever said it to my face. Do you understand how that feels? To learn something this important about your own life, from people who were merely present in the room when it happened, rather than from the person it actually concerns? The accusation landed with the full force of truth, and Cade found he had no defense against it, only the growing, uncomfortable understanding that every choice he had made these past weeks, meant as careful protection, had instead cost Ren the simple dignity of hearing the truth from him first, in his own words, at a moment that belonged to the two of them, rather than to a crowded council chamber. You're right, he said finally, quietly. I should have told you the first night. Every day after that only made the eventual telling harder, and I let fear convince me that waiting was strategy rather than cowardice. I'm sorry, Ren. Not for the bond. Never for that. But for how you learned about it. Ren was silent for a long moment, studying him with an expression that had softened only slightly, still guarded, still hurt, though the coldest edge of her anger seemed to ease under the plain honesty of his apology. "I need time," she said finally. "This is enormous, Cade. Being someone's mate isn't a small thing, and finding out this way, after everything else that's already happened between us, doesn't make it easier to trust what comes next." "Take whatever time you need," Cade said, and meant it, though every instinct in him wanted to close the distance between them instead, wanted to explain every reason the bond had felt too large and too frightening to speak aloud, until fear had made the decision for him. "I won't push you toward anything you're not ready for. I only ask that you let me try to make this right, in whatever way you'll allow." Ren nodded once, not quite an agreement, not quite a dismissal, and turned back toward the garden without further words, leaving Cade standing at the edge of the lavender beds, with the full, uncomfortable weight of his own cowardice, finally laid bare in front of the one person he most needed to understand it. He watched her go, aching with a regret sharper than any border loss he had ever suffered, and understood, walking slowly back toward the castle alone, that whatever came next between them would depend entirely on whether he could prove, through action rather than title, that he deserved the trust he had so carelessly put at risk. Seraphine found him a short while later, standing alone at the window of his study, and did not need to ask what had happened, since word had already reached her wing before he'd even finished crossing the corridor. "I heard," she said simply, settling into the chair across from him. "The whole castle has heard. By now. I ruined it," Cade said, "before it had even properly begun." "You didn't ruin anything," Seraphine said. "You told the truth badly, and at the wrong moment, which is a very different thing from ruining it entirely. Ren is not a woman who abandons something simply because it started clumsily. Give her the space she asked for, and show her, with your actions rather than your excuses, that you understand exactly what you cost her by waiting this long." Cade said nothing, staring out at the darkening courtyard, and did not tell his mother that beneath his regret sat something colder and more urgent, the growing certainty that Garrick's silence along the border would not last much longer, and that a mate bond now known to every envoy in 3 neighboring packs had just become the single most valuable target his enemy could ever hope to strike. 3 days passed before Ren sought Cade out on her own, and in that time he kept his distance exactly as he had promised, though every hour of it tested a patience he had not known he possessed. He busied himself with border reports and increased patrol schedules, with Rowan's growing concern about Garrick's continued silence, and with a dozen small tasks that gave his hands something to do, while his mind circled endlessly back to the hurt in Ren's eyes at the garden gate. She found him in the early evening, standing at the training yard fence watching a routine drill, with the distracted air of a man whose thoughts were elsewhere entirely, and she did not waste time on preamble. "I've had time to think," she said, coming to stand beside him at the fence, her eyes on the drilling warriors rather than on him, as though the distance made the conversation easier to begin. "About the bond. About everything." "I meant what I said," Cade said carefully. "I won't push you toward anything." "I know," Ren said. "That's actually part of what I've been thinking about. You've had weeks to sit with the knowledge of this bond. Weeks to decide how you felt about it before you ever said a word to me. I've had 3 days. It doesn't feel fair to expect myself to have answers as quickly as you did." "That's fair," Cade said. "I'm not angry about the bond itself anymore," Ren continued, finally turning to look at him. "I've had time to understand that it isn't something either of us chose, and I don't blame you for what your instincts did the moment you saw me. What I'm still working through is the weeks of secrecy that came after. The throne room, the garden. All of it makes more sense now, knowing what you were carrying, but it also means I spent weeks being managed, rather than being trusted with the truth." "You're right to feel that way," Cade said, and did not try to argue or soften it, understanding now, after his mother's careful counsel and his own quiet reflection, that the only path back to Ren's trust ran through honesty rather than justification. "I told myself I was protecting you from Elias's suspicion, from Garrick's rumors, but underneath that reasoning was something smaller and less noble. I was afraid. Afraid that if I told you plainly, you'd look at everything the bond demands of you, the crown, the politics, the danger that seems to follow this family everywhere, and decide it wasn't worth staying for." Ren was quiet for a moment, considering this with the same careful attention she gave every difficult conversation. "That fear says more about you than about me," she said finally. I've never once cared about the crown, Cade. If anything, the crown makes this harder, not easier. I liked my quiet life. I liked being no one important, free to make mistakes without an entire court weighing every decision I made. Being your mate takes that away from me, whether I want it to or not. And I think you assumed my hesitation would be about status, when really, it was always going to be about everything I'd have to give up to stand beside you. The honesty of it struck Cade harder than any accusation could have, because it revealed a truth about Ren that he had somehow missed in all his careful watching, so focused on whether she wanted a throne, that he had failed to consider what accepting him might actually cost a woman who valued her ordinary, unremarkable freedom above almost anything else. I don't want you to lose yourself in this, Cade said slowly, working the thought out as he spoke it. Whatever this becomes between us, I don't want it to mean you stop being the woman who kneels in the dirt with her seedlings, or corrects stubborn warriors at the training yard, or sits with my mother through an entire afternoon, simply because grief deserves patient company. If being my mate means losing that, then I understand exactly why you'd hesitate. Something in Ren's expression softened at that, genuine surprise crossing her features, as though she had not expected him to understand the shape of her hesitation so precisely. That's the first thing you've said since the dinner that actually sounds like you're thinking about what I need, rather than what the bond demands of both of us, she said. I'm still learning how to do that, Cade admitted. I've spent 3 years ruling by instinct and control, because that's what kept the pack alive after my father died. You don't respond to either of those things, and I don't think you should have to. I'd rather learn how to be someone worth trusting than fall back on the habits that got me through easier problems. Ren studied him for a long moment, the training yard drills continuing behind them, forgotten now by both of them entirely. I'm not saying yes to anything yet, she said finally, but I'm not saying no either. I'd like to keep talking. Honestly this time, without throne rooms or council chambers deciding the timing for us. I can do that, Cade said, and felt, for the first time since the disastrous council session, something loosen in his chest that had been tight with dread for days. They walked together through the quieter paths behind the training yard as the evening deepened, talking without urgency now, about smaller things, about Ren's mother and the herb garden she'd tended before her death, about Cade's father, and the particular weight of inheriting a crown before he felt ready to carry it. It was, Cade thought, the first conversation between them that felt like it belonged to two people rather than to a king and the healer he had wronged, and he found himself reluctant to let the evening end. In the days that followed, small moments of ordinary trust began accumulating between them, each one worth more to Cade than any grand gesture could have managed. Ren joined him for a quiet dinner in his private study rather than the formal hall, and though the conversation started carefully, both of them still testing the ground beneath this new understanding, it eased eventually into something warmer, Ren asking about his father with genuine curiosity rather than polite obligation. He sounds like he was patient with you, Ren said, after Cade described a memory of his father teaching him to track a wounded deer through fresh snow, correcting his form without ever once raising his voice in frustration. That's rarer in fathers who also happen to be kings, I'd imagine. He believed a king who ruled through fear alone would eventually be ruled by it as well, Cade said. He wanted me to lead like he did, firmly, but fairly. I've tried to hold on to that, even in the years since he died, though I know I've leaned harder into the firm than the fair, more often than I should have. You've been alone with an entire pack's survival resting on your shoulders since you were barely more than a boy, Ren said. I think you've done better than you give yourself credit for, though I understand why control became easier to reach for than patience. You've never once let me get away with using that as an excuse, Cade said, something almost fond in his voice now. I don't intend to start, Ren said, though there was warmth beneath the words rather than sharpness, and Cade found himself smiling at that, a real smile, unguarded in a way he rarely allowed himself even in private. Seraphine, delighted by the visible thaw between them, took every opportunity to encourage the pairing further, inviting Ren to more family meals, mentioning offhandedly how lovely the garden looked in the mornings when the two of them happened to walk it together. Cade noticed his mother's not-so-subtle matchmaking and said nothing to discourage it, privately grateful for every excuse it gave him to spend unhurried time in Ren's company, learning the small details of her that had nothing to do with bonds or crowns at all. He learned she hummed without realizing it, while grinding herbs. He learned she disliked overly sweet foods but had a particular weakness for tart apples. He learned that her laugh, once he'd finally earned enough of it to hear regularly, was low and genuine, and entirely unlike the careful, measured tone she used with everyone else at court. It was not a full resolution, not yet. Ren still kept some careful distance in place, still weighed her words before fully committing to whatever future the bond was quietly building toward. But the wariness that had followed the council chamber's disastrous announcement had eased into something gentler, something that felt, to Cade, dangerously close to hope. Their fragile progress was interrupted 3 days later, when Rowan arrived at Cade's study, at an hour that immediately signaled trouble, his expression grim, in a way that stripped away every ounce of the cautious optimism Cade had begun allowing himself. "Scouts confirmed it an hour ago," Rowan said, without preamble. "Garrick's forces have moved from the ridge camp. They're not advancing on the border directly. They've split into smaller groups, moving quietly, avoiding our usual patrol routes." He paused, choosing his next words carefully, watching Cade's face for the reaction he clearly expected. One of those groups was last spotted heading toward the southern trade road, the one that runs closest to the healer's quarters and the market square. The blood in Cade's veins turned to ice. "Ren," he said, already moving toward the door before Rowan had finished speaking. "We don't know for certain that's their target," Rowan said, following quickly behind him. "But given what the entire pack now knows about your mate, and given how badly Garrick's rumor campaign failed to fracture your court, I don't think we can afford to assume it's a coincidence either." Cade did not slow his pace through the corridors, every instinct in him screaming with the same fierce protective urgency that had first announced itself the night of the dinner, except now it carried the sharp edge of genuine fear, rather than simple recognition. He thought of Ren in her garden, unaware of any of this, unaware that the same bond she was only beginning to accept had just made her the single most valuable target Garrick could hope to strike, a weapon aimed directly at the one vulnerability Cade had never learned to fully guard. "Get every available guard to the healer's quarters immediately," Cade said, his voice carrying the flat, absolute authority of a king preparing for war, rather than a man simply worried for someone he loved. "And send word to my mother's wing. If Garrick's people are moving toward the southern road, I want the entire family accounted for, and protected before the hour is out." Rowan peeled off to relay the orders, and Cade continued alone through the darkening corridors, his heart pounding with a fear far sharper than any border threat had ever managed to provoke in him, the terrible, clarifying understanding settling over him that the quiet, careful progress he and Ren had only just begun to build together might be about to collide, without warning, with the single greatest danger his entire reign had ever faced. He reached the courtyard just as the first wave of guards assembled, torches lit against the gathering dark, weapons drawn and ready at Rowan's sharp command. Cade barked orders of his own, sending a second unit toward his mother's wing, and a third to seal the southern gate nearest the trade road, his mind running through every possible approach Garrick's scattered forces might take with the cold, rapid clarity he usually reserved for battlefield strategy. This felt different. Every other threat he had faced as king had been a matter of territory, of pride, of resources contested between rival packs. This threat aimed directly at the two people who had, in the span of a few short weeks, become the softest and most essential parts of his entire life. "Cade." Seraphine's voice reached him across the courtyard, and he turned to find her hurrying toward him, a shawl thrown hastily over her shoulders, her face pale but composed. "Rowan's man told me. Is it Ren?" "I don't know yet," Cade said. "I won't know until I reach her." "Then go," Seraphine said, gripping his arm with sudden fierce strength. "I'll be safe here, with the guards you've already sent. Go to her, Cade. Whatever it costs, don't let fear slow you down the way it did before." Cade did not need to be told twice. He broke into a run toward the southern road, guards falling into formation behind him, the cold night air sharp in his lungs, every step carrying him closer to the one truth he had finally, fully accepted, somewhere in the last few days without hesitation left to question it. That Ren Callahan was not simply his mate by instinct or bond, but the person he most needed to protect, whatever the cost, whatever the danger, and whatever it finally required of the crown he had spent 3 years learning to carry alone. Ren had no idea anything was wrong, until the healer's quarters went suddenly, unnaturally quiet. She had been finishing the last of her evening tasks, sorting dried herbs into labeled jars while Nora banked the fire for the night, when the usual sounds of the courtyard outside, distant voices, the clatter of the evening watch changing shifts, simply stopped. Wren looked up from her work, some old, animal instinct prickling at the back of her neck before her conscious mind had caught up with the sense that something had shifted in the air around them. "Did you hear that?" Nora asked quietly, already moving toward the window. Before Wren could answer, the door to the healer's quarters burst open, and two men she had never seen before stepped inside, moving with the deliberate, practiced quiet of people who had planned this entrance carefully. Nora screamed once, before a third figure caught her from behind, and Wren, every instinct in her honed by years of steady hands and calm crises, did not scream at all. She grabbed the nearest heavy object, a stone mortar sitting on the work table, and swung it hard into the first man's temple as he lunged toward her, buying herself half a second she used to scramble backward toward the rear door. It was not enough. A second man caught her arm before she reached it, wrenching her back with enough force to bruise, and Wren fought with everything her body had, twisting, biting, driving her elbow hard into his ribs, refusing to make this easy for him even as a third man moved to help subdue her. She managed one clear look at Nora, pinned but unharmed against the far wall, before a cloth soaked in something bitter and cloying pressed hard against her own mouth and nose, and the room began to blur and tilt around her. "Don't hurt her," one of the men muttered, low and urgent, as her knees buckled. "Garrick wants her alive. He wants the king to know exactly what it costs him to flaunt a mate this openly." That was the last thing Wren heard clearly, before the darkness took her fully under. Cade reached the healer's quarters minutes later, guards fanning out around him, and the sight that met him stopped his heart cold. The door hung broken from its hinges. Herb jars lay shattered across the floor, dried leaves scattered like ash. Nora sat against the wall where she'd been left, shaking but unhurt, cradling a bruised wrist, and the moment she saw Cade, her face crumpled with a fresh wave of fear. "They took her," Nora said, before he'd even asked. "3 men. They came in like they knew exactly what they wanted, and exactly where to find her. She fought, Cade, she fought so hard, but there were 3 of them, and only one of her." Something in Cade went utterly, dangerously still, the cold, controlled discipline of the Alpha King, settling over him like armor, even as underneath it, a far more primal fury clawed for release. "Which direction?" he said, his voice flat and terrible in its calm. "South," Nora said, "toward the trade road. I heard them say something about Garrick before everything went dark for me too." Cade turned to Rowan, who had already anticipated the order, and was relaying it to the assembled guards before Cade finished speaking it aloud. "Track them. Now. I want every available warrior on that trail within minutes, and I want Garrick to understand exactly what he has just declared by taking her." The pursuit tore through the night, at a pace that left even seasoned trackers struggling to keep formation, Cade running at the front with a single-minded focus that blocked out everything except the scent trail his wolf had locked onto, the moment he caught the faintest trace of Wren's fear in the ruined healer's quarters. He had led warriors into border skirmishes before, had commanded pack forces through tense standoffs at the ridge, but nothing in 3 years of rule had prepared him for the particular, all-consuming terror of tracking the woman he loved through darkened forest, knowing every passing minute carried her further from safety and deeper into whatever plan Garrick had constructed around her capture. They found the trail breaking off the main road roughly an hour later, leading toward a small abandoned mill that had once served the southern villages before the river changed course years earlier. Rowan held up a hand, signaling the group to slow, and Cade forced himself, with tremendous effort, to match his pace to caution, rather than the reckless speed his instincts demanded. "If they're holding her there," Rowan said quietly, "we go in careful. Garrick's men are counting on us, charging in blind with fury clouding our judgment. Don't give them that." Cade nodded once, forcing the wildest edge of his fear back under control, though it cost him more discipline than any council negotiation ever had. They circled the mill in careful formation, guards fanning out to cover every exit, and Cade caught, through a gap in the old wooden shutters, a glimpse of firelight inside, and the shapes of several men standing guard around a figure bound and slumped against a support post. Wren. She was awake, he saw with a fierce surge of relief, her head lifted, her eyes sharp with defiance, even bound and surrounded by armed men, who clearly had not expected her to still be fighting the ropes at her wrists. One of Garrick's men, A broad-shouldered enforcer Cade recognized from prior border encounters as a man named Dorian, paced in front of her with the casual menace of someone confident in his numbers. "Your king's warriors won't reach us in time," Dorian was saying, his voice carrying faintly through the shutters. "By the time they find this place, Garrick will already have what he needs. A message, delivered exactly where it will hurt most." "You've clearly never met him," Ren said, her voice steady, despite everything, sharp enough that Cade felt a fierce, unexpected pride cut through his fear. "He'll find you, and when he does, I'd start worrying less about your message, and more about whatever's coming through that door." Dorian laughed, low and unimpressed, though something in his posture shifted, wary despite his bravado. Cade used the distraction to signal his guards into final position, and at Rowan's sharp nod, they moved as one, breaking through the mill's weakened door and windows in a single coordinated surge that gave Garrick's men no time to organize a defense. The fight that followed was fast and brutal in the way such things always were, though Cade's guards, disciplined and prepared, made short work of Dorian's smaller group, subduing them without the reckless chaos Dorian had clearly been counting on. Cade himself moved through the confusion with singular purpose, cutting a direct path toward the post where Ren remained bound, ignoring every other threat in the room in favor of reaching her. "Cade," Ren breathed, relief and exhaustion washing across her face, as he dropped to his knees beside her, working the ropes at her wrists free with hands that shook more than he would have liked to admit. "I'm here," he said, his voice rough with everything he'd held back through the long, terrifying chase to reach her. "I'm here. You're safe." "I knew you would come," Ren said, and despite the fear and exhaustion in her voice, there was something else beneath it too, a quiet, hard-won certainty that had not existed between them a few short weeks earlier. "I never doubted it for a moment." Behind them, Rowan's guards finished securing the last of Garrick's men, Dorian himself restrained and furious. His carefully laid plan collapsed entirely in the span of a few violent minutes. Cade pulled Ren gently to her feet, keeping one steadying arm around her as her legs, still unsteady from whatever had been used to subdue her, threatened to give out beneath her. "Garrick will know within the hour that this failed," Rowan said grimly, surveying the captured men. "He'll expect retaliation." "Then he'll get exactly that," Cade said, his voice carrying the cold, absolute promise of a king who had just watched his enemy attempt to steal the single most important person in his life, and who intended to make certain, in whatever way necessary, that no one ever mistook his restraint again for weakness. The journey back to the castle passed in a blur of adrenaline slowly draining into exhaustion, Ren riding in front of Cade on his horse, wrapped in his cloak against the night chill, her head resting against his shoulder, more from depleted strength than any deliberate closeness, though Cade found he did not mind the reason at all. Rowan rode ahead with the captured men secured under heavy guard, already sending runners forward to alert the castle of their return, and to summon Della to prepare for Ren's care. They arrived to find the courtyard already lit with torches and full of anxious staff, word of the attack having spread through the pack within the hour, and Seraphine pushed through the gathered crowd the moment she spotted them, her face a mixture of relief so profound it looked almost like pain. "Ren." Seraphine reached them before Cade had even fully dismounted, her hands finding Ren's face, checking for injury with the same fierce, searching urgency Cade himself had felt at the mill. "Thank the stars. Thank every star in the sky." "I'm all right," Ren said, though her voice was hoarse and unsteady, the adrenaline that had carried her through the ordeal finally beginning to fade into simple exhaustion. "Tired, bruised, but all right." "Get her inside," Seraphine said to Cade, already moving to walk beside them as they crossed the courtyard. "Della is preparing a room near mine. I want her close, where I can see for myself that she's healing properly." Della examined Ren thoroughly once they reached the castle, confirming bruised wrists and a shallow cut along her hairline from the initial struggle, along with lingering grogginess from whatever had been used to subdue her, but nothing that would not heal fully with rest and care. Cade refused to leave the room throughout the examination, standing near the window with his arms crossed, watching every movement Della made with the sharp, protective attention of a man who had come far too close to losing everything that mattered to him in a single night. "She'll be sore for a few days," Della said finally, packing away her supplies, "but she'll recover completely. She's stronger than most warriors I've treated, truthfully. Whatever fight she put up before your men arrived, it likely saved her from far worse." Once Della had gone and Seraphine had reluctantly retired to her own rooms nearby, promising to check in again first thing in the morning, Cade finally allowed himself to sit beside the bed where Wren rested, some of the iron control he'd maintained through the entire ordeal finally beginning to crack. "I thought I might lose you," he admitted quietly, his voice rough with everything he'd held back since the moment Nora told him Wren had been taken. "I have led this pack through border skirmishes and hostile envoys, and every threat Garrick has thrown at us for 3 years, and none of it terrified me the way tonight did." "I fought them," Wren said, her voice tired but steady, some of her usual dry composure returning even through exhaustion. "I want you to know that. I didn't just wait quietly for someone to rescue me." "I know," Cade said, something fierce and proud breaking through his exhaustion. "Nora told me, and I saw it myself. The way you spoke to Dorian, even bound and surrounded. You are, without question, the bravest person I have ever had the privilege of loving." Wren's eyes softened at that, the word loving settling between them with quiet, undeniable weight, the first time either of them had spoken it plainly, rather than circling around it, through talk of bonds and instinct. "You've never said that before," she said softly. "I should have said it long before tonight," Cade said. "I let fear keep me from telling you the truth about the bond for weeks, and I nearly lost the chance to ever tell you the rest of it. I love you, Wren, not because the bond demands it, though I won't pretend that pull isn't real. I love you because of everything I've watched you do since the night I first saw you, the patience you gave my mother, the honesty you never once softened for my comfort, the courage you just showed men who thought they could break you simply because they outnumbered you." Wren reached for his hand, her grip weaker than usual but no less certain, and Cade held it carefully, mindful of the bruising at her wrist. "I love you too," she said. "I think I have for longer than I let myself admit, somewhere between the garden and the training yard, and every quiet, stubborn moment since. Tonight only made certain I wasn't willing to lose the chance to say it." Outside, the first gray light of dawn had begun creeping over the horizon, and somewhere in the castle, Rowan was already organizing the interrogation of Garrick's captured men, gathering the intelligence that would determine exactly how Cade chose to answer this attack. But for now, in the quiet, torchlit room, none of that mattered as much as the woman beside him, alive and safe and finally, fully his, in every way that counted beyond bonds and instincts, and the crown that had once felt like the only thing worth protecting. Garrick's answer to his failed plot arrived 3 days later, in the form of a formal envoy, stiff with wounded pride, delivering a carefully worded message that stopped just short of admitting fault, while offering enough concession to avoid open war. Cade read it twice in council, weighing every word against the intelligence Rowan had gathered from Dorian and the other captured men overnight, and understood immediately that Garrick, having lost the element of surprise and 3 of his best enforcers in a single failed attempt, had no appetite left for further escalation, not yet. Not while Ashgrove Pack stood united and alert to every move he might make next. "He'll wait now," Rowan said, once the envoy had departed and the chamber had emptied of everyone but the 2 of them. "Lick his wounds, rebuild his standing among the packs who watched this fail so publicly, but he won't forget this humiliation either. We should assume he's still watching, still waiting for the next opening." "Then we'll make certain he doesn't find one," Cade said. "Not in my border, and not in my court." The weeks that followed brought a different kind of change to the castle, one Cade found himself grateful for, after so many years of careful, guarded distance from his own people. News of the failed kidnapping spread quickly, and with it, any remaining trace of Elias's earlier suspicions dissolved entirely, replaced by open admiration for the healer's assistant, who had fought off 3 armed men and spoken back to her captors without flinching. Wren, still recovering from the ordeal, found herself greeted with unexpected warmth wherever she walked the castle halls now, staff and warriors alike, offering quiet nods of respect that had nothing to do with her closeness to the crown, and everything to do with the courage she'd shown when it mattered most. Seraphine, meanwhile, had thrown herself fully into planning what she insisted must be a proper claiming ceremony, refusing to let her son delay any longer out of caution or political calculation. "You've spent weeks letting fear decide the timing of everything between you and Wren," she told Cade firmly, over breakfast one morning. "I won't let you make that mistake again, with something this important. The pack needs to see their king claim his mate properly, publicly, without hesitation. It will do more to secure your standing, than any border patrol ever could. Cade, who had learned by now not to argue with his mother once she'd set her mind to something, found he did not actually want to argue at all. The weeks since the mill had changed something fundamental in him, stripped away the last of his careful hesitation, and left behind a clarity he had been circling for far too long, without ever fully claiming it. He wanted this, not because the bond demanded it, not because political stability required it, but because he could no longer imagine his life, or his throne, or his future, without Wren standing firmly beside him in all of it. He found her in the garden one afternoon, kneeling among the lavender beds that had become as much her sanctuary as anyone's these past months, and settled onto the grass beside her, rather than standing at the gate the way he once had, too uncertain of his welcome to do more than watch from a careful distance. "My mother wants a full ceremony," he said. "My mother wants a full ceremony," he said. Public, formal, the kind that leaves no question in anyone's mind about what you mean to this pack, and to me. Wren sat back on her heels, studying him with the calm, unhurried patience that had first drawn him to her months ago, before either of them understood what the pull between them truly meant. "And what do you want?" she asked. "I want you," Cade said simply, without hesitation, without the careful political calculation that had once governed nearly every decision he made. Not as a strategic alliance, not as a solution to Garrick's threats, not even simply because the bond chose you for me. I want you because you make my mother laugh again after 3 years of silence. Because you fought 3 armed men rather than surrender quietly, and still had the nerve to threaten them with my temper, while you were bound to a post. Because every single day since I first saw you, my life has been better for having you in it, and I don't want to spend one more day pretending caution is a good enough reason to wait. Wren's eyes shone with something bright and unguarded, and for once she did not offer a measured, careful response, only reached for his hand and held it tightly. "Then yes," she said, "to the ceremony, to all of it. I want this too, Cade. I have for longer than I let either of us admit." The night before the ceremony, Rowan found Cade standing alone on the castle ramparts, looking out over the training yard where he had spent so many quiet evenings these past months, watching Wren tend patience and correct stubborn warriors with the same steady patience that had first pulled him toward her. "Nervous?" Rowan asked, coming to stand beside him. "No," Cade said, and found, to his own mild surprise, that it was true. "I've spent 3 years nervous about nearly everything that mattered, Rowan. Border threats, council votes, whether I was leading this pack the way my father would have. This is the first thing in a very long time that I feel completely certain about." Rowan smiled, the kind of easy, genuine smile he rarely allowed himself to show even his closest friend. "I remember the night you told me you'd found her," he said. "You looked like a man who'd just been handed a problem he didn't know how to solve. I told you that you were in trouble, and I meant it as a joke, mostly. But I don't think either of us understood then just how much trouble you were actually in." "The good kind, as it turns out," Cade said. "The very best kind," Rowan agreed. "I've watched this pack for years, Cade. Watched you carry every burden of this crown mostly alone, because you didn't trust anyone else to share the weight of it properly. Wren didn't just become your mate. She rebuilt your mother, steadied your court, and somewhere in the middle of all that chaos, she taught you how to actually let someone stand beside you, instead of simply serving beneath you. That's rarer than any bond, if you ask me." Cade said nothing for a long moment, watching the last of the evening light fade over the training yard, letting his friend's words settle into him, alongside everything else this long, difficult, unexpectedly joyful season had taught him. "Thank you," he said finally. "For every warning, every bit of teasing, every honest word you never softened for my comfort. I don't think I would have found my way to tomorrow without it." "That's what I'm here for," Rowan said, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "Well, that and keeping Garrick's forces off our ridge. But tomorrow, let's just focus on the wedding." The ceremony took place 2 weeks later, in the great hall that had once hosted the diplomatic dinner, where the bond first announced itself. Transformed now, with garlands of lavender and chamomile, that Wren and Seraphine had grown together in the garden they'd revived side by side. The entire pack gathered to witness it, along with envoys from neighboring territories eager to see for themselves the woman who had survived Garrick's plot and won the heart of their Alpha King in the process. Cade stood at the front of the hall in formal dress, watching Ren walk toward him, with a steadiness that had nothing to do with nerves and everything to do with certainty, dressed simply, but beautifully, in pale green, that suited her far better than any elaborate court fashion could have managed. Seraphine stood near the front, unable to contain the joy written openly across her face, dabbing occasionally at her eyes with a handkerchief she'd clearly brought prepared for exactly this purpose. The ritual words passed between them with quiet solemnity, promises of protection and partnership and shared purpose that Cade meant more fully than he had ever meant any vow in his life. And when he finally sealed the claiming mark at Ren's shoulder, feeling the bond settle fully into place between them, a sensation like warmth flooding through every part of him at once, the hall erupted into cheers loud enough to shake the old stone walls. Afterward, amid the celebration that spilled out into the courtyard and lasted well past midnight, Seraphine found the two of them for a quiet moment, away from the crowd, her expression soft, with a happiness that had been absent from her face for far too many years, before Ren ever knocked on her door with a satchel of remedies. "I still remember," Seraphine said, "the first time you sat with me in my rooms, when I could barely bring myself to speak to anyone else in this castle. I didn't know then that a single afternoon of honest conversation would end up rebuilding this entire family. But I suppose that's exactly what happened, isn't it? You befriended a grieving old woman before you ever properly met her son, and somehow that turned out to be the thing that saved us both." "I didn't do anything special," Ren said, the same modest deflection she'd offered Della months earlier, though the warmth in her voice now carried none of the uncertainty it once had. "You did everything special," Seraphine said firmly. "You gave me back my life, and you gave my son back his heart. And I will spend the rest of my days grateful that Della's schedule happened to be full, on exactly the right afternoon." Cade, standing beside his mate with his mother's happiness spread openly across her face for the first time in years, found himself thinking back to that very first night, to a healer's assistant who had looked at him with all the awe reserved for a mildly inconvenient obstacle, utterly unaware that she was about to become the single most important person in his entire kingdom. He had spent 3 years believing control was the only thing that kept his pack, and himself, standing upright. Ren had taught him, patiently and without ever once seeking his favor for it, that some of the strongest things a king could build were made not from control at all, but from honesty, from patience, and from the simple, unshakable courage to let himself be loved. As the celebration continued around them, and the first stars rose bright over the castle that had learned to laugh again, Cade pulled his mate close, understanding fully, at last, that the trouble he had found himself in the very moment he saw her, had turned out to be the greatest fortune of his entire life. Months later, when the first frost of autumn had settled over the garden Ren and Seraphine had rebuilt together, the two women could still be found most afternoons among the lavender beds, though their conversations had shifted now towards smaller, sweeter things than grief and healing. Seraphine had taken to bringing an extra shawl for Ren on cooler days, fussing over her with the particular attentiveness of a woman who had waited a long time for a reason to fuss over anyone again, and Ren, who had once bristled at unnecessary coddling, had long since stopped protesting it, secretly grateful for the warmth behind the gesture. Cade found them there one afternoon, his mother laughing at something Ren had said, her hand resting with quiet affection over the small, still subtle curve of Ren's stomach, and he stood at the garden gate for a long moment, exactly as he had that very first day, though nothing about the feeling in his chest resembled the caution and confusion of those early weeks. There was only warmth now, full and certain, watching the two women who had rebuilt his entire family from nothing more than an afternoon of honest conversation and a satchel of remedies meant for a kitchen maid's fever. "You're staring again," Seraphine called out to him, without even turning to look, the same words she'd used months ago at this very gate. "I know," Cade said, walking toward them at last, no longer nervous, no longer hesitant, only grateful, deeply and endlessly grateful, for the mate who had befriended his mother in a single afternoon, and, in doing so, had quietly, thoroughly, and permanently rearranged every part of his life for the better.